Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome back to Modern Leadership. It is so good to be with you. Today, I want to talk to you about personal branding. You know, the battle to create brand recognition is taking place in a media world that is noisier and more crowded than ever. That's why some entrepreneurs, CEOs, and professionals have come to realize that they can set themselves apart by looking beyond corporate branding and instead focus on building their personal brand, positioning themselves as an expert and leader in their industry and marketplace. These are the words of today's guest expert, Rusty Shelton. Rusty is founder and CEO of Zilker Media, the country's premier PR and marketing agency for authors, thought leaders, and brands. Incidentally, and as an aside, some of our guest experts on Modern Leadership recently have all been referrals from Zilker Media. They're terrific to work with. All right, back to the bio. Rusty is the co-author of Authority Marketing, How to Leverage the 7 Pillars of Thought Leadership to Make Competition Irrelevant. He's also the co-author of Mastering the New Media Landscape, Embrace the Micromedia Mindset. He's an active keynote speaker and has been featured in Forbes, Inc. magazine, Wharton, Huff Post, and many other top media outlets. And today, he is our modern leader. Rusty, so great to have you here. How are you this morning?
I'm doing fantastic, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Well, it looks like you're doing a lot of different things. And as I mentioned in the bio, Zilker Media has been a referral source of ours for a long time now. We love the guests that you're bringing on. Take us back to that time. How'd you start Zilker Media?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting so many of our clients. I always get great feedback on the podcast, and it's my honor to be here with you today. So Zilker Media is actually the second agency that I've started. My first entrepreneurial venture, I started a company called Shelton Interactive back in 2010. And that firm, Jake, was really focused primarily on authors at that time. So we did websites and social media and PR. And the idea with the model around that agency was instead of just doing PR or just doing social or just doing websites, the thought was thought leaders, authors needed really all of that handled under one roof. And so that agency went really well. We did more than 30 New York Times, Wall Street Journal bestsellers. And we were actually acquired in early 2016 by a company out of Charleston, South Carolina, Advantage Media Group, and now Forbes Books. And I still do plenty of work with them alongside the founding of Zilker Media, which was about a year and a half ago. So it's kind of interesting, Jake, looking back. This is my second go at it from an agency perspective, and I've got a lot of my key team members from the first agency back, and it's a real blessing just to have a chance to kind of go through and focus on the things that we found to be most successful and take some of the lessons that I learned through the years and apply them.
And so how is Zilker Media different from this Shelton Interactive?
So the biggest thing around the focus for us with Zilker Media is much more sophistication in terms of integrating what we're doing on the PR side of things, what we're doing on the digital marketing side with the growth of an email list as well as lead generation. So one of the big things that we work on at Zilker Media, again, in addition, just kind of tactically getting people on TV, getting their books reviewed, growing an online presence within social media is really the focus, Jake, around, all right, how do we actually set up a meaningful lead magnet that gives your audience a lot of value? And it's interesting, I was a huge fan of your leadership superpower assessment. I found that nothing works better in terms of giving value to your audience, giving them a chance to dip their toe in the water for your content, but also growing the email list than a good assessment. And we can dig into that a little bit more today, but we've had 500,000 assessments for our clients taken over the last couple of years. And it's just been a tactic that I so believe in because I believe it's the purest exchange of value that exists between a thought leader or an authority and their audience.
Yeah, and I found that myself as well. Not only that, I think it's kind of fun. I created that superpower assessment. It's 20 questions that really walk you through some of the mindset that it takes to be, what platform of leadership you lead from. And it's a lot of fun to create, but it's also a starting point of conversation as you interact and talk with people who have come to your website or found your personal brand, it gives you a platform to really begin that conversation. Before we jump into that, though, I'm really curious about this story of yours and your background. You've started 2 agencies. Why start a second agency and not just shift the focus of the first agency, or just add that? It sounds like an enhanced value. Why start a completely new business?
Well, part of that was due, Jake, to the acquisition. So the first business, we were acquired by Advantage Media Group and Forbes Books, and again, that's been a wonderful journey for me, and I still do a lot of work with them on the publishing side, in particular with Forbes Books. And so the founding of Zilker Media, in large part, is kind of a fresh start post exit, if you will. And so again, with the new agency, it's been a great chance to go back and say, all right, man, the long list of lessons that I learned, mistakes that I made with my first business, and we could spend all day talking through those. But the benefit of that for me as a leader is going through and acknowledging those, and it's kind of cool to have a blank slate again and to be back at it. So it's been a lot of fun.
And the reason I find this so fascinating is because this podcast and my personal brand, or my company, started out as Family Before Fortune, building the life of your dreams with the people you love. And, we made a transition. We shifted to modern leadership, and it's been a good transition for us. But I'm always interested in hearing the stories, the development, the lessons learned of leaders as they go from, one venture, one idea, one experience to the next. And so this Zilker Media, now, you guys are PR marketing experts, and you focus a lot on authors. I know that a lot of the people that have come on the podcast here have been authors. And so let's go back and talk a little bit about why this authority marketing is so important, and why leaders are starting to shift from this corporate brand focus, to more of a personal branding.
Yeah, and really, Jake, it's kind of a symptom of the environment that we're in right now. And I mean, if you think about the general public, increasingly we are skeptical, over the top skeptical of corporate brands, as well as what I think of as more generic media. So large kind of traditional media. We're increasingly looking at biases when we hear from a corporate brand, whether it's on social media or an ad. Our guard is up. We're expecting to be sold to. And so what a lot of authorities, what a lot of thought leaders are finding, and in particular, Jake, entrepreneurs who don't have a marketing budget that can compete with some of their key competitors, the way you punch above your weight class, both in terms of impact, but also the way you accelerate the speed of trust with your audience, is not by leading with some generic corporate logo or a company name that is extremely difficult to differentiate. The way you set yourself apart is by leading with value. And in large part, this really boils down to success today is thinking more like the media than a marketer, with the way you approach your content strategy, with the way you approach your marketing. And what I mean by that, very practically, and I think you're a great example of this, Jake, is really going out and, instead of selling to an audience, instead of pushing products or pushing some kind of a marketing message, thought leaders are thought of as somebody that you learn from, that prescribes solutions. And so this idea of authority marketing for us is, how do you go out there and, instead of doing what everybody else is doing, which is spending money to try to build affinity with an audience with a corporate brand that is incredibly difficult to do, instead of going that route, how do you take a much more efficient, much more effective approach, which is building affinity and giving value to an audience as an individual thought leader?
This is very fascinating, and I want to pick your brain on one topic and one idea that I've asked a few past experts about, and I haven't really been satisfied with the answer. And that is, let's say 20 years ago, if you wanted to be an expert, you had to have a book. I mean, that was the way to be an expert. Everybody looked at you, and it didn't matter how good it was as long as you had one. And 15 years ago, it was a blog. Maybe 10 years ago, it was a podcast. 5 years ago, it was something visual, as far as, a Facebook story or an Instagram story or a YouTube channel. Where are we going today? What do experts today need to have or show? And I have an answer of what I think, but I wanted to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, Jake, so you kind of ran through what I think of as more tactical platforms. So in other words, where to put the content. And to me, the most important thing throughout all of those years and also still today is not the where or kind of the how, if you will, in terms of should I do a podcast or video or a blog or whatever. It's actually, to me, going back to much more of a diversified content strategy. So the mistake I often see people make, Jake, is when they get started, and again, whether they're blogging or podcast, et cetera, typically the way they approach it is by focusing only on their own IP. Meaning, and I'll often go back to a newspaper as an analogy on this, when you get started with your content marketing, it's really like, I encourage people to think about it as their personal newspaper. Most people either fill their newspaper with ads, meaning it's just overly promotional, or they fill their newspaper with op-eds, meaning it's just the Jake Carlson show again and again and again, meaning it's only your stories, your vulnerability, your experience. And that's a slow grind in terms of growth. So what I always recommend for people to think about is kind of a 3-part approach to your content strategy. So category 1 is what I think of as you-driven content. So this is behind the scenes with Jake. This is your stories, your lessons learned, your vulnerability, evergreen content from your IP. But instead of going 90% like most people do, you limit that to a third. The second category is news-driven content. So David Meerman Scott calls this newsjacking, but it's taking what's front of mind for your audience and connecting it back to your message. And then the third category is what we're doing right now, which is relationship-driven content. And that is, instead of being a media outlet that only gives your opinion, good media bring in the top experts or other perspectives. And so what I love from a content strategy perspective is how can you use your content marketing as an excuse or a bridge to build new relationships in a peer-to-peer way. And so we could go into the weeds of kind of which platforms to focus on, Jake, but what I've found in my experience is the where, in terms of kind of where you're putting content, is much less important than the what in terms of the actual content that you're putting out.
And I love this answer. It's a different answer. It's a different direction than I thought we would go with this, because you're right. I mean, I was focused on the platforms and I wanted to hear what you had to say about the platforms, but I think your response is actually more valuable to us. It's really focusing in on, this new concept of what we're putting out there into the world, and not so much a focus on what delivery mechanism that we're using. And I would agree with you 100%. I've said this often. The reason that I do this podcast week after week, and the reason that I bring on guest experts, is because I love to meet new people. And it would be very difficult for me to fly out to Austin and get you to go to Starbucks and spend 30 minutes. But to have you sit down with me on this podcast, I mean, we're going and I can ask you any questions. It's just like a coffee visit without all the headache and the travel that's involved in it. And so I really appreciate that. Let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about this new book of yours, Authority Marketing. And I want to jump into these 7 pillars of thought leadership. Before we do, I just want to add, and maybe you can confirm this strategy that we're talking about, authority marketing, works in any field. We're not just talking about digital marketers or online business owners. We're talking about you could be a dentist, or you could be a pediatrician, or you could be a lawyer. These strategies are universal. This is the way that marketing is going for the future of all business, not just for online business. Is that correct?
That's correct. And arguably, Jake, it works better in those businesses. So, whether you're a dentist or an attorney or a financial advisor or a physician, the magic in those spaces of approaching, this idea of authority marketing is so few of your peers know how to do it or even know that it's possible. Everybody's doing the same old thing. And so industries like leadership and digital marketing and consulting, Jake, are a little further down the line. So it's still important, but the speed to success, it takes a little bit longer there because it's harder to differentiate. But in those other businesses, what I've seen is the impact is almost immediate because I always look at value, Jake, as directly tied back to differentiation. So what makes you different from the other people that I'm looking at? And if you're a financial advisor, for example, there's 300,000 financial advisors in the United States. Every single one of them has the appropriate degrees. Most of them have decades and decades of experience. So, when I'm looking at 5 different financial advisors, how do I tell one from the other? And if I'm doing my due diligence ahead of those meetings and going online and looking for information, if one of them has published a book, if one of them is regularly visible in Forbes or does local media quite a bit, has won awards, and gives me a little bit of their content ahead of time, that's somebody I'm feeling lucky to even get an appointment with. And when I sit down in front of that person, I'm expecting to learn something. I'm expecting them to prescribe solutions, as opposed to perhaps with the other 4 financial advisors I'm looking at, my guard is up and I'm almost interviewing them in more of a commoditized way. So that's a big part of it, is how do you set yourself apart from your competitors before you sit down with a prospect, before you get in the room with them? And we can dig into that, but that's a big part of this authority marketing equation, is the branding piece.
Yeah, and the ROI on this type of marketing is so much higher. I mean, you could drop $3 million and put a commercial on during the Super Bowl, and there's going to be some return on that investment. But when you go dollar for dollar and time for time, the return on investment of this authority marketing is so much higher that our small business owners, our solopreneurs out there, should really be licking their chops thinking about authority marketing, because like you said, this is a new arena for them to go into. If you're a fan of blue ocean strategy, this is where the blue ocean is right now. The red ocean, where all the sharks are and where everybody has been competing, that's not the way to differentiate yourself. And so let's jump into this. You've got these 7 pillars. Can we walk through them? What's the first pillar of thought leadership?
Let's do it. Yeah. First pillar of thought leadership is branding and omnipresence. And so on the branding side of things, the interesting thing here, Jake, and for a lot of your listeners, this may be the first time they're really thinking about this, but your brand in today's media landscape, the way I kind of define branding is creating an image in the minds of your audience. And what's really interesting today, Jake, is we've really got 2 very distinct phases to creating that image in the minds of your audience. So phase 1 is what we call pre-engagement. So it's before somebody meets you, before they hear you give a speech, before they work with your company, before they meet you in person. In phase 1, the image that you create in somebody's mind is not created over the phone or in person. It's created on page 1 of Google, on your website, on your LinkedIn profile. If we're lucky and they find that, that's where it's created. The second phase, or the second image that you create in somebody's mind, is what we think of as post-engagement. So it's once somebody reads your book, once they hear you give a speech, once they buy your product or work with your company. And phase 2 is really where the basic question is, did we over deliver or under deliver on the promise that was made in phase 1? And so if you think about brands that you do business with repeatedly, Jake, they're ones that consistently over deliver in phase 2. The mistake that I see a lot of entrepreneurs make, especially early on, is they rely solely on phase 2 for lead generation, meaning they put their head down and the only thing they're focused on is doing a really good job for clients, which, by the way, obviously has to be done.
Yeah, super important.
Absolutely. And this is a moot point if you're not doing a good job for clients. But if that's the only way you're getting lead flow is referrals and word of mouth, the limiting factor there is you don't have any direct control over the growth of your business. You've got indirect control. You do a good job. Hopefully that client's at the right dinner party next to the right person and your name comes up. But if we rely only on phase 2, we're beholden to other people to grow the business. And so what I often encourage entrepreneurs to think about is, how do you take that really positive phase 2 image and move it upstream so that person that's referred to you, or that person that finds your website online, is the image that you're creating in phase 1 congruent with the quality you're actually going to provide in phase 2? And so a big part of that, Jake, is, do you actually own the first impression for your brand online? And so one of the things I want to encourage your listeners to think about is, just to get really practical for a second, is doing what we call an online brand audit of your name. So if you go to Google and type in your name, the big question I would encourage your listeners to ask themselves is, number 1, can you be found? So if you can't be found, my guess is that typically comes back to one of two reasons. Either you've got an incredibly common name, so something that's shared by a lot of other people, or you just haven't gotten active at all online. And so one of the first questions to ask yourself during that online brand audit, Jake, is do I need to change my name? Meaning, do you need to add a middle initial or a middle name if you've got a very common name so that you can own search around that name? Okay, if you think about it, if somebody's referred to you by name and they go to Google looking for you, if they cannot find you, how hard is this going to be to get where you want to go? So the very first piece of this, and this goes back to me, Jake, to this idea of virtual real estate. If you've got a really common name, you are on a piece of property with a lot of other people named Steve Johnson, and you're all trying to build towers higher than the other Steve Johnson in terms of visibility. If your middle initial is A, like yours, Jake, and you add in the Steve A. Johnson, what happens is you walk across the street and you buy a lot that nobody else is on. And so the speed to owning that discoverability is so much quicker. So practically, we can dig into this as far as is helpful, but practically I want to encourage your audience, if you do not own your name as a website address, firstnamelastname.com, my encouragement is right after you listen to this, go to GoDaddy or go to your preferred provider and buy your name as a website address. It is virtual real estate. You don't have to build the custom home on it yet, but buy the lot. So you've got that in the future. And if your name is a common one, or if your name's not available, consider adding in your middle initial or your middle name to that URL to make sure you have it.
Very practical advice and something that I had to do myself. You know, you mentioned Jake A. Carlson. That is my website because Jake Carlson was taken. So own the real estate. Now, let me ask you. So you go to Google, you Google your name, and you come up. How high up should we be? I mean, obviously, I want to be number one, but without paying for things, or maybe as I'm starting out, I'm not going to be up there. So where do I go now to create this authority to get my name up higher? I mean, all I hear about is different algorithms that Google uses, and I can't keep up with that. I'm trying to be a dentist. I'm trying to be a lawyer. I don't have time to worry about all this.
No question about it. So, you know, what we know, Jake, on Google, the statistics tell us 75% of the clicks happen in the first 3 results on Google. So if your name is a search result that you're not above the fold on Google results, we're missing opportunities right now. And so the good news is for most people, Jake, if they've got a name that either is unique or they add in that middle initial or the middle name, once they start with some content marketing and they start creating that blog on the website, typically what we see is the speed to getting up the page is pretty quick. Again, if you're buying the right lot. So in other words, if you're not trying to compete on Steve Johnson, you're focused on Steve Allen Johnson or Steve A. Johnson as your brand name. And so that's one piece of it. So the second piece is if you've got your name as a website address, the second piece is, okay, well, let's start to widen your net to start to catch some of those search queries. And that's why the mistake I see a lot of thought leaders or would-be authorities make is they build a website that's essentially an online brochure, meaning it's about you, it's the services that you provide, it's maybe a speaking page. If you're an author, it's a book page. But a website like that is essentially a virtual brochure. Meaning if I get there, I'm going to do one of two things. Either I'm going to fill out your contact form or I'm going to hit the back button. And probably I'm going to do the latter, which is hit the back button, because most people that land on that website the first time aren't ready to buy. And so the shift that I want to encourage your audience to make as they think about their web presence is, this goes back to this idea of thinking more like the media than a marketer. Your goal the first time somebody gets to your website is not to have them buy something or have them reach out for some really significant conversion. That's very tough to do. Your goal when they get to your website is, how do you extend your interaction with that person? How do you give them a reason to take a seat in your auditorium, as we talk about in the book? And that's why, it goes back to the tactic that you're using effectively, and that I mentioned around, offering a free quiz or a free assessment. What some other people do, which I don't see work quite as well, but is better than nothing, is a free download, a free ebook or a free workbook or a free white paper. And so the big thing for me, Jake, just as we think about this idea of branding, first step is, do you own your brand? So in other words, do you own that first impression if somebody's looking for you? The second question, assuming we can check that first box fairly quickly, is when I get to your website, are you creating an image in my mind that is congruent with the actual quality you're going to provide once I work with you? And that gets into an issue which we can dive into if it's helpful, of building authority by association.
Okay, well, and looking at the time, obviously, we're not going to be able to jump into all these topics, although we should just have you back 7 times to have one episode on each of these pillars. I do want you to know that while you were talking, I Googled my name without the A, Jake Carlson, and I came up as number 2 on the first page, and I was on 3 times on the first page. And by the way, the top result was from Facebook. Just like a generic, are you looking for Jake Carlson? Then I Googled Jake A. Carlson, and I came up the top 3 spots on Jake A. Carlson, including 4 of the top 5 spots on there. So it can happen. It does happen. Now, let me ask you this. So I'm a dentist, and I work for, Arizona Dental, or I'm a lawyer, and I work for, Carlson, and Carlson. Should I be doing this on my own page, or should I be focusing on my corporate brand?
Well, I would very strongly encourage you to focus on your personal brand as a starting point. So, for example, if you're a dentist and you own Arizona Dental, fantastic. We want to focus both on the corporate brand, but also on your personal brand. The reason, though, Jake, to focus on the personal brand, especially if you're a dentist and you're trying to reach a local audience, is, again, the way we stand out is not being one of 10 corporate dental practices in Phoenix, or one of however many, 50 or 100 that are probably there. It's being the one dentist who spoke at the local TEDx this year, who is regularly on local TV, who is seen as a community leader, is interviewing different local leaders for their podcast. So in other words, that person is seen in a very different light from other dentists who are seen as operators underneath a corporate brand. There's not much that differentiates each of those people versus the one local dentist who has published a book, again, is regularly speaking. And so the big thing here, and a lot of people sort of discount their own personal ability to put content out there, to be seen as a bit more visible. And this, to me, goes back to a really important question, which is, this idea of authority marketing is not about building an ego first brand or building, a hey, look at me kind of brand. What it's really about is mission driven thought leadership. So in other words, it's really about being known as somebody who is focused on making an impact. And the way you make an impact in a quicker and bigger way is not through that corporate brand. Again, it's through your kind of personal thought leadership.
And so as you create this personal brand for yourself, and let's say you're a lawyer and you have your website, your corporate website, and then you have your personal name, do you link it back to your corporate website? I think what a lot of our listeners are probably doing is they're using their personal website for personal things like cat videos or whatever that may be as far as the joke goes, as opposed to actually tying them in together and using one to feed into the other.
Yeah, they definitely need to link back and forth, Jake. No question about that. And again, the idea with building more of a personal brand or thought leadership is it's essentially an on-ramp back to the business. So the goal there is for that website to serve as a starting point. We're gonna the likelihood that someone is going to take an assessment on a website for an author that they perceive as a thought leader is dramatically higher than the likelihood somebody's going to take an assessment on a generic corporate brand website. And again, it goes back to this idea of my guard is up on a corporate site. When I visit an individual site that I perceive as a thought leader, I'm ready to learn. I'm really seeking to get value there. And if you lead with that value, that's where you've got a great opportunity to build an audience and build a lot of benefits to the corporate brand. One other quick point that I think is important. A lot of people get nervous. Is my law firm going to get angry if I build my own website or if you don't actually own the business? And let's say you're a leader within a business that somebody else owns. The strong encouragement that I would have for you is the more visible your personal brand is, the more thought leadership that you command, the more benefit that business is going to get from you. And yes, it does give you personal leverage, but it also dramatically benefits that business, and you become a much more important on-ramp for them and much more important piece of visibility for them.
And I'm glad that you brought up that point, because it was the topic or the thought that was on my mind is, let's say we've got a middle manager listening to us, which we have an awful lot of them on this podcast, and they're growing they're growing within their own corporation. They're climbing the ladder, as you will, inside, and how they tie this back into a corporation that they don't own. I believe that this offers them additional job security in that it distinguishes you not just in the marketplace of competitors, but also in the marketplace of your fellow coworkers. I mean, this shows initiative, it shows drive, it shows intelligence, it shows a ability to rainmake, to bring people into your company, as you will, an on-ramp for onboarding people into your business. And so I think that this is something that every individual should be considering doing within their own personal brand, their own personal, life and career. So, Rusty, I really appreciate this conversation. As you know, we have 7 pillars of thought leadership, but we only have a half hour of Modern Leadership podcast. So we're not going to be able to get to the other 6, which is perfectly fine, because there's a place that they can get the other 6, and it's called the bookstore. They can pick up a copy of this book, read through it, and get the 7 pillars of thought leadership. Before we let you go today, though, there's a section I love in this podcast called Learning from Leaders, where we add a little personal to this business conversation and find out a little bit more about you. Sound okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Our first question then is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading?
So I'm reading The Handmaid's Tale actually right now, which is a little bit more personal reading this summer. I just got back from a vacation and picked up that book in the airport, and I'm really enjoying it actually.
Very good. I'm not sure I know what it's about.
So this is a book written back in the mid 80s. Hulu has made this into a TV series that's gotten a lot of rave reviews, and that's how I initially heard about it. And it's essentially about a postmodern kind of apocalyptic version of the United States, where the ruling party, the environment is in such a place where they're having trouble having kids and kind of moving the population forward. And so it's about how do they manage that, and kind of this dystopian, super depressing environment, but it's really, really well written, and it's kind of it's a scary look into what would be a pretty terrible future for this country.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. Our next question then is your leadership superpower.
So I was the confident leader as I went through that assessment. By the way, you did a fantastic job with that, and it's interesting kind of looking back across the career. I think that's something that's come for me through mistakes and through lessons learned, and I hope that I'm sort of fully embracing that right now. But I can tell you I'm a much more confident leader than I was starting that first company back in 2010.
Yeah, and I think confidence is a journey, right? It's not a destination. You don't arrive at confidence, but you continue to build it. And I think it's such a vital superpower as you're going through, especially as a leader, because if you don't have that confidence within yourself, if the people who are looking to you as a leader don't feel that confidence within you, then they're gonna hesitate to follow. And so I think it's such a valuable superpower. The other thing is I want to thank you for mentioning that on the show. You've done over 500,000 quizzes, you said earlier, and you've been participant in creating a whole bunch of them. I know that you also are participant in a company that creates them. And so to hear you compliment what we've got on J.K. Carlson as the superpower quiz is important to me, and I appreciate that. So thank you very much. How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra that you live by?
Sure. So, and this is really the way that I approach kind of my entrepreneurial venture in leadership is Peter Drucker's famous quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I so over the top believe in. I've really focused entirely on facilitating the kind of environment where, culture is really the the thing that drives happiness for our team, which then drives happiness for our employees. And to me, that's a really fun and effective way to approach business.
Yeah, and I think this could also be an additional podcast in and of itself. I think when Peter Drucker mentioned that quote, that was more of the culture that you had within an organized office. But now that we're more spread out, especially in the digital space, how do you create that culture? And like I said, I think this is a completely additional podcast, but a very fascinating concept of creating culture within the organization that you have, whether it's virtual, whether it's spread out, or whether you're in one geographic location like an office building. So I love that quote. Final question then, is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues?
Yeah, this is a book that we worked on a couple years back called The One Thing, that was written by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. Sold more than 1 million copies. Gary Keller, of course, the co-founder of Keller Williams. And this book really looks at what I think is one of the central questions that leaders have to ask themselves, which is, what's the one thing so that by doing it, everything else is either easier or unnecessary? And practically, Jake, I think about that as what's the high leverage activity? What's the thing that can be done that changes everything else versus the kind of work harder piece, and it really gets back to this idea of working smarter. So I love that book, and that's a book that is one of my favorite ones that we've ever been involved in.
And it's a book that we love on Modern Leadership. It's been on our bookshelf for 4 years now. It's been a book club book. It's just a terrific book, worth a read or a reread if you've already read it. All right, Rusty, as we close this out, I want to give you just a couple minutes to let us know how we can find out more about you, about Zilker Media, how we can work with you, and how we can pick up some copies of your book.
Well, thank you, Jake. Yeah, for more information on the book, and you can actually take an authority assessment on our website. But if you go to authoritymarketingbook.com, that's available to you if you're curious kind of where you are on the authority spectrum. My personal website is rustyshelton.com, and I've got a blog there and some resources. And then Zilker Media, our agency is zilkermedia.com. That's Zilker media.com.
Well, wonderful. And we're going to link all of that up on the show notes for this episode. I've already been over to your personal website, read through your blog. You have some great stuff. You're living what you're preaching. You're doing what you're telling us to do, and you're doing it well. Thank you for coming on Modern Leadership and being this week's guest expert.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's my honor. Thank you very much.
All right, my friends, what did you think of that? It was great to spend some time with Rusty and really dive into some stuff. We talked about getting into the 7 pillars of content marketing, and we only cut through one of them. But because it was so actionable and because it was such important stuff, I didn't want to stray away from that. I just wanted to continue to dive in, and I hope that it was beneficial for you. I really loved our conversation about the ROI on authority marketing. It's much higher than advertising. It's much higher than a lot of other things that we try to do within our business. So really don't forget that content marketing. And of course, everything that we talked about on this episode of the podcast can be found on the show notes, jakeacarlson.com/ML89, episode 89. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.